So one of our great puzzles that we have to look at is, why do humans actually have such large brains? If we look at the size of our brains, it's actually quite incredible, even if we consider our body size. Our ratio of brain size to body size is above what would be expected uh, in nature. So it is a puzzle that people have to work out and understand in order to understand our human evolution. In order to make sense of this, we need to go back in time and look at what happened around the time when that process of greater brain development, greater brain evolution actually started to take off. So we have been looking at our split from our other family lines, and we are currently somewhere in this period here. And what you can see in terms of the temperature curves, there is a substantive decrease in the the temperature around that time. And so what happened is, previously we had relatively strong tropical vegetation throughout the African continent, and what happened now is, with the cooling of the temperatures and the increasing ice sheets covering the northern hemisphere in particular, what happened is the tropical forests receded and grassland started to spread. There were also some evolutionary changes, so a specific type of grass evolved which had a better ability to withstand the drier and cooler temperatures, so preserve some water in the longer stalks. And with that, what happened as well is, there were a whole lot of grass eaters that would now spread further out. So instead of the tropical environment, now what started happening is, we have more these kind of open grasslands. So you would have a few woods areas, then some open land, and then like some mixture that would significantly change the available resources for our ancestors. And so one of the important things that we have to think about is, how did our ancestors actually get their food, and what would have been the best strategy? There are a couple of different hypotheses out there, and people have talked about, like, maybe our brains developed in order to allow us better food extraction. So this is especially fruits, because our ancestors did depend a lot on fruits. So one idea is that our brains developed to keep better track of these resources that were scattered through these wider areas, because woodlands would be distributed along or across an open grassland. The other hypothesis is, what happened is, our ancestors were living in groups, and so we had to keep track of everyone in our group. And so there was a push to develop larger brains in order to keep track of everyone around. So this is the kind of strict social brain hypothesis. What these researchers did is, they created phylogenies and they matched the group size. So like all these different primates, like in how big are their average group sizes, and then they try to link that up with the amount of social skills that you would need to have in order to navigate these social structures. And then they also compared the extent to which these different animals would rely on fruits and nuts. So you need to keep track of the nutritional dispersal in a specific environment, or whether you relied on other food sources that are not requiring that much tracking of resources in a distributed area. And what they found was actually that the biggest contribution to make sense of this increasing uh, brain size, what contributed to the increasing brain size was actually the body size. So as animals became bigger, you needed to have bigger brains, which is, sorry for the pun, is a no-brainer in a way, right? But it also means that, because we know that from a number of different species, as the temperature cools, it's more efficient to cool uh, or to regulate the body if you have a larger uh, body size. So there might be, even in that body size component, there might be some element of ecological pressures there. But then the second biggest contribution to explaining these differences in brain size was actually the diet. So those primates that required keeping track of food resources, fruit resources, seeds and nuts in a distributed environment had a larger brain size than would be expected just by their body size. And group size in itself only contributed a relatively small proportion. So this argument, this analysis seems to suggest that one important driver for our large brains was that our ancestors needed to keep track of food sources in an environment that was changing quite rapidly and quite dramatically because of global cooling. Obviously, these analyses that they ran with these phylogenies may not be the best like options. So, for example, they used group size, but it's not necessarily the best measure of social complexity. There's also the importance of technical intelligence, so how you actually can extract resources over and above locating resources in a two-dimensional space like in an open savanna. There are also questions about whether the whole brain size is the best measure, because some people have argued the neocortex, so basically the parts where a lot of the social information processing is happening in our brain, the more complex cognitive processing, is actually more important to look at. Although there are arguments around that as well. And also the evolutionary trajectories may differ. It's not that these trajectories are always the same across different lineages. So we had talked about convergent evolution already, or divergent evolution. So it could well be that the selection pressures are slightly different in different lineages. And obviously also special diets and food preparation. One thing that we will talk about in due course is the use of fire and how that may have contributed in giving us a certain advantage over other animals. A different group of researchers now took this idea again with the changing environment, so greater dispersion of food that needed to be located in our ancestral environment required our ancestors to use different foraging strategies. And one of the arguments was, or one of the questions was, how can we understand what foraging strategy might work best? So they set up these kind of simulations, and they manipulated variables, for example, the distribution of complementary foods. So the task for our avatars in these simulated environments was to get a balanced diet between proteins and carbohydrates. So they had to locate food in this environment, and food was distributed according to different specifications. So it was either really rare, or you would have clumped areas, like very rich areas within an otherwise scarce environment, where you would have a lot of carbohydrates or a lot of proteins or a bit of both. And then they also modeled what was the nutritional states of our ancestors. Were they quite hungry or quite satiated? And so what were also their requirements? Would they need more protein or more carbohydrates, or both? And then they set rules for for movement. So, for example, they always specified that there should be relatively constant speed, and the direction would either be set to random, so-called random explorations, and these random explorations could be motivated, for example, by being hungry, which is something that we know from animals. If they are hungry, they start exploring their environment on a relatively random basis. And then they also set some of these directions based on previous experiences, so personal preferences or previous orientations, but importantly also through social influences. So this is kind of either an attraction towards and alignment with other group members or repulsion away from nearby individuals. And this is partly due to the benefits that you would gain if you, for example, team up with other avatars. Would you have a greater chance to explore an environment? And what would happen if you find something? So would there be conflict? So because if you explore an environment, you find something, and then everyone can essentially feed themselves, hooray, you're in a win-win situation. If there's not enough food, then fights will break out, and it becomes actually more productive for an individual to go off on his or her or themselves, and therefore there would be a greater benefit for like individuals to explore themselves. And what they found was that if they looked at all these different variations of these parameters, and what they found was that collective foraging, so individuals like teaming up and exploring the environment, would make sense under a number of specific situations. And the most likely emergence of collective foraging, so like these small foraging bands going out and cooperating with each other for like finding food, would emerge in environments where there was overall relative scarcity, but there were patches that were relatively rich. And so this social foraging would only emerge in these specific like conditions that we assume are actually quite representative of what happened during this geological time in our history. So the conditions back then, with that global cooling and the decreasing availability of food, but the food was highly clustered in certain areas, would now make it more efficient for our ancestors to actually collaborate with each other and explore these resources together. And the crucial thing was that these resources were patchy, they were clustered in specific areas. So there was sufficient food for everyone to actually feed, and there was relatively low likelihood that fights would break out. Yeah, so the ecological conditions set a stage for our ancestors to, number one, those ancestors with a larger brain that would be better able to keep track of all these resources in this environment would have an advantage. And second of all, working together with others was actually more beneficial, and we're going to look at some of these other reasons in just a second, was more beneficial than going out on yourself. So these two mechanisms, these two conditions kind of worked together and fit with what we know about the global temperatures, the global availability of food back in that time. So these kind of behavioral ecology patterns, so this is something that is very common, these kind of simulations are very common in behavioral ecology, match onto what we know through archaeological records, through geological records of the conditions that were present during that time, and could explain why our ancestors slowly were set on a path that would lead to larger brains and social life. So This is where Dunbar and Schultz's work comes in, because they brought it together all these different hypotheses of why social brains emerged during that time. So on one hand, they acknowledged that the habitat was deteriorating, and so the habitat quality was a driving force for the emergence of social brains. And then there was also a predation risk. What happened during that time, and we will briefly mention that later again, our ancestors, they, like if you think about it, like we have two legs, but we don't have these kind of very strong teeth. We're relatively fragile, relatively weak. If you think about all these other, like top line predators that are around at that time, so, like the famous saber-toothed tiger and things like that. These animals, like would have had us for lunch, breakfast, and dinner any time. So, like for us, for our ancestors, it would have been more beneficial and safer to actually explore these patchy areas in small groups. So these small foraging groups also protected us against predation. And what this now sets in place is a complex series of relationships and mechanisms that lead to a selection pressure to develop larger brains, because larger brains, according to Dunbar and Schultz, are enabling us to navigate our social environment in a more efficient way. Because there are a number of different factors that play a role. So first of all, we already talked about the necessity to keep track of resources in a relatively resource scarce but patchy environment. Second of all, as we started foraging together, because it was more efficient and protected us from other predators, other mechanisms had to be negotiated. Because if you think about it, living in social groups is actually time consuming, because you have to get used to everyone else. You have to groom others. You have to, negotiate all these competitions within the group, etc., etc. So, spending time with others is actually time consuming and distracts us from foraging effectively. So Dunbar and Schultz argued that these kind of requirements within the group, so navigating these greater social complexities within the group as our ancestors started foraging together, would set a stage that made those individuals that were better able to navigate these social complexities within the group more likely to survive. So there were natural selection pressures that led to an advantage for those individuals with larger brains that would allow them to navigate, to interact with others in these social environments more efficiently. So we started to have grooming-based coalitions where, like animals would team up, they form small alliances that would protect them against other group members. So you would have these small little cliques, small little groups within the larger group, and that would make it more efficient overall because it provides greater predation risk, it provides better extraction of resources in this large environment. And this also set into place kind of development towards the ability to mentalize, to think about what others are thinking, because now you need to understand the intentions of others in order to change your own behavior. So this ability to mentalize, or theory of mind, is something we're going to look at in the next few sessions next week, but it is something that probably during this time developed to a much greater extent than in other social animals. One other interesting aspect from Dunbar's and Schultz's summary of all this literature is that actually life history also made it was also really important if you think about it, because large brains, like even though they're advantageous for us in these environments, like as a female, like it is very dangerous to have, like your offspring with a large, like appendix, which is your brain, and try and push that out into the world. So the only option that would be viable to have adult animals that would be able to sport these kind of large brains is an extended developmental period where these young ones, once they're out in the world, once they're born, they need time in order to grow their brains to a large enough size that would enable them to compete in this social and ecological environment and would not hurt the mothers during the birth process. Right? And what happened as well is during that time, this extended developmental period, these kids now would learn all these skills to navigate the ecological environment, so all the uh, tools, techniques, the knowledge that you have in order to navigate and find food, but also navigate the social environment, like navigate the social hierarchies, form alliances, etc., etc. And this study here by Brindle and colleagues looks at the relative developmental stages in chimpanzees and in humans, and what they found was that actually the order of lifespan development tasks in human infants and in chimpanzee infants follows more or less the same trajectory. So they're looking at the relative age and what kind of tasks need to be mastered at each of these stages relative to the lifespan of a chimpanzee or lifespan to a human is relatively simple. So the that trajectory of like developing brains outside the womb was already set by most likely by the last common ancestor with chimpanzees. So this is just to say that like the development of larger brains is not just driven by natural selection pressures, but it also fits in with a whole lot of other changes in our social environment, in our life history that needed to be managed and changed somehow. So selection, natural selection here is a very complex process that changed a number of different features of what it meant to be a primate and the developmental history of a primate, and with that also the ability for us to develop larger brains. But all of this took place in a specific changing natural environment. And this is where another study is quite interesting, because we often think about this, like evolutionary process. It is very linear. It is driven by these mechanisms towards greater complexity, greater sophistication, etc., etc. But this paper by Naya and colleagues reminds us that it's often, like very external ecological conditions that can set up the basically the environment within which certain types of natural selection, so the natural selection pressures would shift and therefore would give an advantage to certain types of biological developments. And what they argue, and I think that is quite interesting and fits in with what we know about the larger geological, atmospheric, climate conditions back at that time, is they focus on thermoregulation and the costs that come with potentially having larger brains. What they looked at is the fossil record and the increasing cranial capacities that indicate something about the brain size, and whether that correlated what we know about temperatures during that period. And they found a relatively strong correlation between the brain size on one side and the decreasing average temperatures on the others. And from their perspective, this suggests that having larger brains is adaptive in colder climates because of the reduced thermoregulation costs of spotting larger brains. So the ambient temperatures and the climate variability basically enabled, to some extent, the selection for larger brains, or at least took off selection pressures against larger brains. So there are a couple of points here in that argument. The first one is, as we developed bipedalism, so we started to move about in an upright position, we reduced the exposure to the sun of our body, right? So our body would absorb less sunlight on average, and therefore our body needed to be regulated, or needed less energy to regulate our body temperature. The second thing that happened is, as our ancestors started to move around upright, that creates energy. So potentially looking for food, potentially running away from predators, or trying to hunt, like for small animals, etc., etc. That creates heat, and we have to keep all our organs in a relatively stable temperature internally. So larger organs are easier to keep regulated, or keep in a constant temperature stage. And as like humans started to move around more, cover larger territory, we started to lose hair, and instead we started to develop a fat layer that would now insulate our temperature, and we would start sweating. So like we would regulate our temperature through a different mechanism compared to other animals. And so like these various bits and pieces come together and allow us now to decrease the risk of overheating. So which now, with these kind of cooling temperatures, it kind of takes off this brake to keep our brains somewhat smaller, right? So we would need less energy on average to keep our brains cool, because the environmental conditions changed, and therefore it kind of allowed the growing of, or the evolution of larger brains to take off. And so like looking at all of these conditions again that Naya and colleagues talk about, is there's a whole suite of variables that are in concordance with what Dunbar and Schultz are talking about, where there is a whole set of social and technological changes. So for example, through this collective foraging, the production of tools and the use of tools, the development of hunting, we will come to that in just a minute. All of this allowed larger brains to develop, but what was the external condition was this cooling of the overall natural environment, which therefore did set the stage for a changed selection pressure on our ancestors that would make these larger brains less costly. So all of this basically is to say that a whole host of factors came together that allowed our ancestors, those ancestors with slightly larger brains, to reap greater benefit and like be fitter within that changed environment, and therefore be able to pass on those genes that encoded for larger brains. So brain evolution was driven by multiple factors, a very complex array of factors, and most likely it was driven by a co-host, like set within this kind of global cooling, this globally cooling Earth, which now made resources scarcer. The resources were distributed in a more patchy way, which now allowed our ancestors, if they started using collective foraging as a foraging strategy, allowed our ancestors to survive better if they teamed up with other group members. It also protected them better from other large predators, but at the same time, so these conditions for using more cognitive powers to keep track of resources was set. And as our ancestors worked together in these kind of small foraging groups, that then required a separate process of keeping track of each other, navigating these social hierarchies, minimizing all these kind of energy and time losses that happen with the navigating of the social strategies, that therefore would allow our ancestors that would be more efficient in solving all these problems, keeping track of these resources, be more likely to pass on their genes. Right? So it's a whole host of interlinked factors that most likely contributed to the emergence of our larger brains.